What possible explanation is there for waking up not in your own bed where you went to sleep, but hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home? That's the mystery we're going to be unravelling today as I bring you one very curious true story and 3 related extremely brilliant books. In 1977, a farmer in rural China went to bed one night and woke up the next morning 600 kilometres away from home with absolutely no recollection of how he got there. And that was just the beginning. But before we get into that, if you're a fan of curious true stories and you love a good book recommendation, then you are in the right place, because that's all we do and we upload every single Sunday. So if you like this video, please click on the like button and make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Now back we go to rural China. July the 27th, 1977, and a 21-year-old farmer called Huang Yanqiu walked a wide dusty road towards the village of Beigao, which is in the northeastern area of China, about 28 miles from the city of Handan. It had been a particularly hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked. In fact, recently most days were really busy because they were approaching and preparing for the autumn harvest season. So it was a very, very tiring time for everyone. Now, Huang had grown up in poverty. He didn't even finish elementary school because he had to leave school and earn a wage to bring in for his parents because they were so poor. He still lived with his parents in this kind of very run-down, ramshackle old house in the village of Beigao. And all Huang seemed to do was get up, walk to work, do a really hard day's work, physical labour, until he could barely stand up. And then he would have to walk all the way home again just to go back to bed and do it all again the next day. So days were very laborious for him, but recently Huang had developed a new love of life and a new zest, because he had fallen in love with a girl from the next village and they were planning to get married after the autumn harvest season. And so Huang, in his spare time, what little there was, and in addition to all the other things he was doing, had been building a house for him and his future wife in the village. He'd built the walls. The only thing that had to be done was he had to put the roof on and the windows in. And so on this particular night in July 1977, before he went home to his mum and dad, he took a little detour to go and have a look at this house because he was so proud of it. And he stood there looking at it and smiling to himself. And he ran his hands across the bricks because the bricks were very expensive, and those bricks that he'd bought represented a lot of hard labour for Huang. And he was so pleased and thrilled with how things were going. So he took one last look at the house, and then he turned and carried on and went to his parents' house where he lived at the moment. And he sat and ate a meal with his parents, and he talked about his day, and he talked about his future wife and the house he was building, which were his favourite topics of conversation. And then about 10 o'clock, Huang was really tired, absolutely exhausted, and so he went to bed, and he fell asleep almost immediately. Now the next morning, Huang's parents woke up to find that Huang wasn't in bed and he wasn't in the house. But that wasn't unusual, it wasn't worrying, because Huang was a very disciplined, very hard-working young man, and he very often got up super early and went to work before anyone else to get a good head start. So they weren't that bothered. The people at the rice farm, however, were bothered because Huang did not turn up for work that day, which was totally out of character. So out of character that they sent another worker to walk all the way to Huang's parents' house to find out if things were okay and what was going on. And when Huang's mother opened the door and heard that Huang hadn't gone to work, she thought, that is very odd, that is not like my son at all. And she said, well, he's probably gone to the house he's building. That's the only other place he goes. Go and check there. He's probably there and he's probably lost track of time. So off this worker went to Huang's new build that he was making further into the village. And he wasn't there either. So he went back to Huang's parents' house and he said to the mother, no, he's not there. And that's when his mother started really worrying, because there were only 3 places Huang would ever be: at work, at his new house, or at home. And he was in none of those places, and so she was really quite concerned. She sent the worker to go and get her husband to see if he could fathom out what was going on, and in the meantime she started knocking on all the doors in the village to ask if anyone knew where her son might be. Now, Beigao is a very, very small village. Everybody pretty much knew everybody else. And so it wasn't long before they were all out, the community came together, everyone was looking for Huang because no one could figure out where he was. They were going around on their bicycles, shouting his name. They went to the neighbouring village, they went to his fiance's house. She hadn't heard from him, she didn't know what was going on. And it was a really big mystery. So by evening, they decided, you know, we've got to find out what happened to him. So they consulted the local governing body. There was a kind of a group, a committee in the village which kind of oversaw things and was in charge. So they took the information to them to see what they thought, and they were very worried. Huang's bicycle, his own bicycle, was still lying against the wall of his parents' house, and his clothes that he wore, his work clothes that he wore every single day, was still in his room, folded up neatly. So wherever Huang was, he was in his pyjamas, barefoot and on foot, because he had no other mode of transport. And so the governing committee of the village decided it was time to call the police. So they got in touch with the police. The police, however, did not do a missing persons report or start looking for him, because they said, you know, come on, he is an adult. It is really weird, but if he wants to go off somewhere, it's entirely up to him. It must have been such a worrying time for Huang's family, because there were no cars, no one had a car. They just had bicycles. There were no telephones in this village. It was so rural. There was certainly no internet in 1977. So basically they just had to sit there to see whether their son came back home of his own accord. Now, on August the 5th, which is 8 days after Huang went missing, the deputy director of the committee of the village came running full pelt down the main road of the village, banged on the door of Huang's parents' house. And Huang's father answered the door and says, oh my goodness, what's the matter? And the deputy director handed him this telegram and he said, you've got to read this. We've just received it, you've got to read it. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at 9 o'clock in the morning on July the 28th. So it would have been around the time that Huang's parents discovered that Huang was not in bed or in the house. But because Beigao was so isolated, it had taken all this time for this telegram to get there. And Huang's father read the telegram and he looked at the deputy director. The deputy director looked at him and they just stared at each other in disbelief, because what the telegram said made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The telegram said about 9 hours after Huang went to bed that July night in his parents' house, he was discovered lying on a pavement in a busy, bustling city called Nanjing, which is located about 600 kilometers to the south of Huang's village of Beigao. The reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so baffled by this telegram is because what the telegram was saying was impossible. 600 kilometers. Now bear in mind, Huang had no car. He didn't even have his bicycle with him. He left it leaning against his parents' house. Even if he walked 30 miles barefoot to the nearest train station, 9 hours does not give him enough time to travel the remaining 570 kilometers to get to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director decided that they must have made a mistake at this deportation centre where he was being held. They had taken him to somewhere which people with kind of mental illness or people who are confused are taken so they can be sorted out and sent safely home. And they thought, you know, they must have picked someone else up. This can't be Huang. So they sent a telegram back to the deportation centre and said, look, we don't think this is Huang. If it is Huang, he's got a very distinctive, particularly marked birthmark on his wrist. Have a look at his wrist, because this birthmark probably isn't there, because this, you know, almost certainly isn't Huang. A telegram came back quite quickly this time, and the telegram said, yes, he does have that birthmark exactly as you describe, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. So someone from your village needs to come over here and collect him. So that happened, and Huang finally got home kind of in the middle of August, about a fortnight after he first went missing. And everyone, his family, all the villagers, his fiancé, of course, were all so relieved to see him. The whole village celebrated his return, and there was a steady stream of visitors to Huang's parents' house because everybody wanted to see Huang and hear his incredible story. They all wanted to know what exactly happened. But Huang was still really confused and didn't really know. So he kind of avoided answering people and just put his head down and changed the topic of the conversation. But then his parents really pressed him and said, look, Huang, this is crazy. Can you please tell us what happened? And Huang said, well, I can tell you what I know, but even that doesn't make sense to me. He said he went to bed in his own room in his parents' house in Beigao. But when he woke up some 9 hours later and opened his eyes, he was lying on concrete. And he looked around him very, very confused. There was nobody really about. And he saw a few street signs. And the street signs said Nanjing on them. So that's how he figured out where he was. And then all of a sudden, 2 policemen dressed in white appeared out of nowhere. They scooped him up off the pavement and took him to this deportation centre. And he said, that's all I know. I don't know how I got there. And Huang was completely lucid, completely with it. He seemed very honest. He looked and sounded exactly the way he had. There was nothing odd about him. Over the next few weeks, Huang managed to reintegrate back into village life. You know, people were a little wary of him. Children were a little wary of him. This is the guy who travelled hundreds of miles in his sleep. But he kind of started to mix back into life and get on with life again. But Huang was really worried. Huang was worried that he would go to bed one night and the same thing would happen again. You know, as time went on, he got more and more relaxed. But he thought, you know, what if this happens again? And his parents said, no, it won't happen again. It's a one-off. It's a strange one-off thing. Of course it won't happen again. And so Huang started to actually believe that it wouldn't happen to him again. But Huang was wrong. So on September the 8th, 1977, that's 3 weeks after Huang returned from home, he went to bed as usual in the village of Beigao in his parents' house. But when he woke up, he was, of course, no longer there. The first thing he noticed were the sounds around him. Now, usually the sounds he would hear when he was asleep or just coming round would be his parents snoring or perhaps birds and insects outside. But on this occasion, when he woke up, he didn't hear any of those sounds. The only sound he could hear was the sound of footsteps on concrete. And it was kind of footsteps of someone walking in high heels, a kind of click, click, click. And these footsteps were getting closer and closer. And then he became aware that he was lying, not against a pillow, but against concrete or cement. And he could hear these footsteps and he was getting more and more anxious and the footsteps were getting closer. He tried to open his eyes and he couldn't. No matter how much he tried, he could not open his eyes and he could not move his body. Eventually the person walked past him. He could feel the air, the breeze of the person as they went past. And the footsteps started moving further away again. And now when he tried, Huang could open his eyes. And so he sat straight up and looked around him and discovered he was in an abandoned kind of city street. The owner of the high heels had disappeared, no sign of them. There was nobody about. All he could see was a clock that said 1 a.m. And he was terrified, as you can imagine, and very, very confused. And he started walking about, just shouting for help in the hope that somebody is around and somebody could hear him. And as he was shouting, he suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. And this voice said, "Are you Huang Yanqiu?" And Huang turned around and there were 2 guys dressed in military uniform. And at first he was relieved and he thought, oh my goodness, thank the Lord, somebody is going to help me. But then he thought, how do they know my name? How do they know who I am? And so he said, you know, how do you know I'm Huang? But they didn't answer him. They just said he was at a Shanghai railway station and they were going to take him to a military base. Huang was so terrified that he just got in the back of this jeep with these 2 men and they drove him away from the abandoned city. And after a while they arrived at a military base and it was surrounded by fencing, razor wire on the top, there were soldiers guarding it, and they went through a series of checkpoints. And when they got to the final checkpoint, the 2 military guys got out, so Huang got out as well, and they kind of almost lifted him by the shoulders through this final checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And all of the guards and the soldiers at the different checkpoints, Huang said that they didn't really take any notice of them. They didn't even acknowledge that they were there. It's almost as though they couldn't see them. Anyway, they finally arrived at this nondescript looking military building, and they went through a door and through a maze of corridors going zigzag all over the place until they got to a giant door, and over the door there was a sign that said Division Headquarters. One of the soldiers knocked on the door, and without waiting for a reply, he opened the door, pushed Huang inside, and the two military guys followed him inside into the room, and they shut the door behind them. Now, in this room, Huang could see this giant, very kind of stately looking desk, and behind the desk was a military man dressed in a very fancy uniform. He was clearly very high up. And this military guy was writing at his desk, and he looked up and he saw Huang, and he was completely shocked, immediately put his hand on his revolver and stood up and said, "Who are you? How did you get in here? How on earth did you manage to get in here?" Now, Huang put his hands up, obviously wanted to make sure this guy knew he wasn't armed. And he said, "They brought me, they did." And he kind of pointed behind him. And the military guy who'd still got his hand on his revolver kind of peered around Huang and said, "Who did?" So Huang kind of looked around, and the two military guys who brought him in had disappeared, which was impossible because if they'd left the room, they were only just by the door. Huang would have heard them. He didn't hear them, but they had vanished. Now, this military guy was very alarmed, and so the first thing he did was to get on his radio and start shouting and screaming for assistance and backup, and pretty soon some more soldiers arrived, and they arrested Huang. And they questioned him for hours on how he managed to get into this military compound. Did he climb a fence? Did he cut the wire? How did he manage to get through the checkpoints? And Huang had no answers for them, no explanation. He just kept saying, "These two guys brought me." But obviously they had disappeared and he couldn't prove anything. But thankfully, they believed him and they allowed him to be bussed home. And he arrived back in the village. And this time people weren't quite so welcoming. This time people were getting a little bit wary of Huang and what had happened to him. Children started to say he was possessed, that there's something demonic going on, and people would start gossiping about him in front of him, in full earshot of Huang. They would start talking about him. Then 11 days later, it happened again. And this time it's a little bit more bizarre, I have to say. This time he told people he'd met two men, and these two men had told him that they were the same two men he'd met before. The original two men, the policeman dressed in white who scooped him up off the pavement when he was in Nanjing and took him to the deportation centre. The same two men who were in military uniform and took him through all those checkpoints. He met them again. They were the same two men in each experience. Except this time, instead of taking him somewhere, he said that they put him on their backs and they flew him around 9 different cities in China for reasons unknown. Now here you can look at these 9 cities that he claims he was flown on the back of two men. And when they'd finished flying him around these cities, they flew him back to Beigao and they dropped him outside his house, which I thought was very courteous of them, all things considered. Now, this third experience sounds very made up, doesn't it? It sounds like a dream. But when Huang was aggressively questioned about it, and bear in mind by this point, Huang's story had really got around. Journalists, media, television, reporters, even the authorities were all very interested in what Huang had to say. And so he was questioned a lot about this third experience in particular. And Huang had very specific, very accurate insider information about all these 9 cities he said he'd been taken to. He knew the weather, he knew the layout of the roads, he knew the buildings, he knew what movies were showing at the movie theatres. He knew everything about these cities, places he'd never been to. This is a rural farmer, an isolated rural farmer without any real contact with the outside world, has never left his village before, suddenly has all this information and very detailed information about cities to which he's never travelled. So maybe it does sound made up, but that really doesn't tally with a fantasy, does it? Now, to this day, no one has been able to discredit Huang. There is so much detailed information, so many particulars. Nobody has been able to expose him as a liar. And if he was a liar, how did he manage to get all the way to Nanjing on that first experience, or Shanghai on the second experience? And also, at one point, Huang took a lie detector test. This is an actual photograph from the test. This is Huang taking the test, and he passed it with flying colours, so to speak. So Huang's story is considered one of the most famous cases of UFO activity in the whole of China's history. People seem to think that the two guys he keeps meeting are actually extraterrestrials, and this is a sketch done based on Huang's description of what these two men, who are consistently in each experience he has, these same two men have turned up, and this is what Huang said they looked like. But before we take a look at some more perhaps conventional theories about Huang and his adventures, let's take a look at 3 brilliant books, all connected to the idea of getting a good night's kip, or not. And the first book is Insomnia by the very brilliant Sarah Pinborough, who I'm sure you all know and love. Excellent thriller writer, I adore her writing. This is a story of Emma Averill, who is a high-powered legal executive. She has a wonderful husband, 2 adorable children, but life hasn't always been that perfect for Emma. In fact, when she was 5 years old, Emma and her sister were put into foster care because of their mother's very erratic, terrifying behaviour. Emma's sister can remember a time when their mother was kind of a normal mother, but all Emma remembers is this monster that her mother became. And she became a monster around her 40th birthday, which is the age that Emma is approaching now. And Emma's really worried that she has inherited some bad blood. And this is exacerbated by the fact that she's currently experiencing crippling insomnia, which was one of her mother's first symptoms. This is a terrifying, plot twisty, utterly brilliant, beautifully dark thriller. Highly recommend it if you haven't read it. If you have read it, it was made into an excellent drama starring Vicky McClure, but it's a brilliant book, highly recommended. And on to book number 2, which is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was first published in 1971. It is, of course, a science fiction novel, and it's set in Portland in 2022. Now, in 1971, 2022 must have sounded pretty futuristic, mustn't it? And yet here we are. And I don't feel particularly futuristic, I'm not sure about you. But in this futuristic world of 2022, a world plagued with violence and catastrophes, George Orr wakes up one day to discover that his dreams have the ability to alter reality. Now, he seeks help from a Dr. William Haber, who's a very, very sketchy psychiatrist. In fact, there are so many sketchy psychiatrists in fiction, we should do a sketchy psychiatrist episode. Because this Dr. Haber starts to manipulate George's dreams when he realises how much power George has to Dr. Haber's own ends. It's incredibly thought-provoking, as well as being entertaining and a page-turner. You know, it explores the self-destructive nature of power and the dark forces within all of us. Which is something that Ursula K. Le Guin returns to again and again in her novels, and she always does it so brilliantly. And finally, book number 3 is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. I do hope I have not butchered that name. I have tried to find, as I always do, somebody saying it, preferably the author saying an unusual name. So hopefully I haven't butchered it. I do apologise. Now, the narrator of this novel, at least on paper, should be happy. She's a recent graduate, she's got a very fashionable, trendy new job, she's got an apartment in a beautiful area of Manhattan, but beneath this glossy exterior, she's dealing with a lot. She's dealing with the recent deaths of her parents, which, whilst it's left her very financially stable, is something that she has not processed properly or come to terms with. She's got an absolute jerk of a boyfriend, I have to say, and a best friend who is really not often the most helpful person to have around. And she's also struggling with horrendous insomnia, and she sees a psychiatrist probably one of the worst psychiatrists in literature. Here's another sketchy psychiatrist. They are everywhere. Trust me, in real life, 99.9% of psychiatrists are not sketchy. You're just going to have to take my word for that. But this very sketchy psychiatrist prescribes her so much sleep medication, stronger and stronger, that our narrator starts warming to the very attractive idea that she could spend an entire year in hibernation and sleep away a whole calendar. This is very satire-esque, it's very compelling, it's extremely funny in parts. It was shortlisted for the Wellcome Prize, and it was also listed in 2018 as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, and quite rightly so. It's an excellent read. If you haven't given this a try, do give it a read and let me know what you think. So let us return to Huang and his adventures, whose issues with sleep may be even more troublesome than all those 3 books put together. Now, by the 3rd flying incident, Huang's story has attracted significant attention. But nobody, despite all these investigations and all these people talking about it, nobody has ever come to a conclusive explanation for Huang's mysterious journeys. There have been numerous theories that have been put forward over the years. So let's take a look at what people say might have happened to Huang. So theory number 1, perhaps one of the most straightforward theories, is that people believe that Huang was abducted by someone and transported to these places overnight, and he was drugged, and that's why he doesn't remember getting there, and his memory loss and his confusion are down to the drugs that he was given when he was abducted. You know, possibly. But why would somebody abduct and drug a rural Chinese rice farmer who lives in an isolated village miles from anywhere, who isn't doing anyone any harm? And why would they drug him, take him somewhere and then let him go? It just does not make sense. There is no motive for something like that. Theory number 2 is that Huang was in fact sleepwalking. You know, sleepwalking is a common thing, especially when somebody is perhaps overworked, overstressed. The work that he was doing at the rice farm and the work on his own building, and the fact that his wedding was coming up, perhaps all these things came together, and because his body and mind was stressed, he started sleepwalking. But sleepwalking is usually done over short distances, and sleepwalkers only really usually stay, not always, but usually stay in familiar territory. So how did Huang manage to walk or travel all those hundreds of kilometers? Did he sleepwalk and get on a train? But even if he did that, then he wouldn't have had the time to get to these places in the allotted window before he was found. So the idea of him sleepwalking probably is not one that holds water. There are many less conventional theories, as you can imagine, including the UFO one, which is very, very popular. Sometimes people have said that Huang had got some kind of psychic ability, mind over matter. He could transport himself over vast differences in short space of time. But all of these kind of more esoteric, shall we say, theories are really quite bizarre and really don't make sense. And the only one that people have really clung to over the years is the idea that Huang was abducted by aliens. Because aliens have to make an appearance in everything, don't they? They can't just mind their own business. Every story, it's aliens. And you've got to ask yourself, did Huang dream all this? When we dream, the front part of our brains, the bits that deal with logic and reason, they go to sleep with us. But the creative side of our brain, the amygdala, wakes up and in the absence of any common sense is an absolute party all by itself. Which is why when you see weird things in dreams, for example, a 20-foot kangaroo walking down the street, or indeed 2 men putting you on their back and flying you over various cities, those things in a dream seem perfectly acceptable because the amygdala is in charge and the amygdala doesn't care about common sense. But if Huang did dream all that, how did he get all of this information, all of these details about the cities that he went to? Things that could be fact-checked, things that, you know, he couldn't possibly have known in a rural village with no telephone, no cars, no contact with people outside of the village, no internet certainly. How did Huang know all that if this was just a dream? As for Huang, he is now leading a very simple existence in rural China, and he keeps himself very much to himself. And for people who think that Huang made all of this up to get attention, Huang's life was pretty much ruined by all of these events. By the third episode, the flying episode, people in his village had completely disowned him. They either made fun of him or they were frightened of him and thought that he was possessed by devils. His fiancée said she wasn't comfortable with him anymore and she broke it up. And he was publicly, regularly mocked and ridiculed. So would he have done all this deliberately and made it up and ruined his whole life for no absolute reason? So what do you think happened to Huang on his nightly adventures? Now, consider yourselves lucky, because I could have told you the story of a Chinese lumberjack who woke up in the middle of the night to find a 10-foot alien woman with 6 fingers in his bedroom, and they proceeded to get intimate. I kid you not. So consider yourselves lucky that I didn't choose to tell you that story. I hope you've enjoyed this week's curious story of these 3 brilliant books, all exploring the idea of getting or not getting a good night's sleep. If you like this video, please click on the like button and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Now, next week we'll be looking at 3 brilliant books all involving children, and one of the most terrifying, curious true stories I have ever stumbled across. It's utterly terrifying, about some children you will never ever forget, and not in a cute way. I'll be back next Sunday with that. In the meantime, have a brilliant week.